Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is the show where we take a whole heap of information, really dig in, and pull out the key stuff for you.
Yeah, we try to cut through the noise, find the core insights, and make complex topics, well, a bit easier to grasp.
Exactly. And today we are diving into something inspired by, those massive chess books you see, the ones people sometimes call the chess player's Bible.
The opening encyclopedias.
Yeah.
Yeah, they can be pretty daunting.
Totally. We're tackling the huge world of chess opening strategy.
It's such a crucial part of the game, isn't it? Especially if you're, say, a high school player looking to level up. Your opponents start knowing more theory.
Right. And getting the opening right really sets the stage for everything else.
It absolutely does. It dictates the kind of middle game you're going to get, the plans available. It's foundational.
But looking at one of those comprehensive guides, wow, it feels like thousands of moves, endless variations. It's just a lot.
It is overwhelming, no doubt. And that's why our mission today isn't about memorizing lines. Forget that for now.
Okay, so what is the plan then?
We want to give you the ideas behind the openings, the fundamental principles, the typical strategic aims. We're drawing inspiration from the breadth of those big books, but focusing on the why.
The why, not just the what, makes sense. So you can actually understand what's going on, even if you don't know the exact book move.
Precisely. It gives you a compass.
Yeah.
So let's start right at the beginning. What are we actually trying to do in the opening? What are the big goals?
Good question. Like the first, say, 10 or 15 moves, what should be top of mind?
Okay, so there are a few core principles that pretty much always apply, no matter what specific opening you play. Think of these as the golden rules. First up is rapid and harmonious piece development.
Rapid development. Okay, get your pieces out fast. Seems obvious. But harmonious? What's that about?
Good point. Rapid just means getting your knights and bishops mainly off their starting squares and into the game. A knight on g1 isn't doing much.
Right.
But harmonious means getting them out so they work together. They shouldn't be bumping into each other or blocking important lines.
Okay, so they coordinate. Like moving a knight helps a bishop, maybe.
Exactly. Or developing a bishop supports a pawn push. You want your pieces to sort of flow together, controlling key squares, supporting each other's roles. It's about efficient teamwork, not just throwing pieces onto the board.
Teamwork, got it. Makes the army stronger. Okay, so develop quickly and harmoniously. What's principle number 2?
The second big one is control of the center. We're talking about those 4 key squares right in the middle. b4, e4, d5, and e5.
The bullseye of the board. Why is that so important?
Well, think of it like controlling the high ground in a battle. Pieces in the center, or pieces that influence the center, just have more options.
More places to move.
Yeah, more mobility. A knight in the center can jump to 8 squares, potentially hitting targets on both sides of the board. A knight on the edge, maybe only 2 or 3 useful squares.
Okay, I see.
And pawns in the center do 2 things. They stake out territory for your pieces, giving them nice squares to land on, and they restrict your opponent's pieces. They make it harder for your opponent to develop smoothly.
That's why 1.e4 and 1.d4 are so popular then. They grab central space immediately.
Precisely. White stakes a claim. And black's response is often about challenging that claim, either directly, like with 1.e5 or 1.d5, or maybe indirectly attacking the center from the flank.
So it's a fight for central territory right away.
It really is. If you lose the center completely, your pieces often end up feeling cramped, passive. It's tough to play from there.
Okay, develop, control the center. What about the king? He seems kind of vulnerable sitting there in the middle.
Absolutely critical. Principle number 3 is king safety. You cannot neglect your king. Leaving him in the center while pieces are flying around, well, that's asking for trouble.
So castling.
Castling is the main way, yeah.
Yeah.
It achieves 2 really important things in one move.
Right, the king scoots over behind some pawns.
Exactly. Gets tucked away, usually on the king side or queen side, behind a pawn shield. And, crucially, it brings your rook towards the center, activating it.
Yeah, gets the rook into the game quicker.
So it's both defensive and developmental. You generally want to castle reasonably early, before things get too wild in the center. An uncastled king can become a target really, really fast.
Makes sense. Secure the headquarters before the big battle.
Couldn't have said it better. So many games, especially at the developing level, are lost quickly because someone just forgot about king safety.
Okay, development center, king safety. Is there a 4th main principle?
Yes. The 4th pillar is creating a favorable pawn structure. Pawns might seem humble, but they are like the skeleton of your position.
The skeleton. How so?
They define the terrain. They determine which lines are open for your rooks and queen, which diagonals are clear for your bishops. They create outposts, safe squares for your knights. They also restrict the opponent's pieces.
So the pawn setup influences how all the other pieces can operate.
Massively. Think about things like pawn chains. They create strong defensive lines, but also point away for attacks.
Or doubled pawns.
Yeah, double pawns are usually bad, right? Often seen as a weakness, yeah, because they can't defend each other, and the front one can be blocked. But sometimes they're okay, or even good. Maybe they open a file for a rook or control key central squares. It's contextual.
Okay.
And then you have passed pawns with no enemy pawns ahead of them on their file, or the adjacent ones. Those can be incredibly dangerous later in the game, potential game winners. So thinking about your pawn structure, avoiding weaknesses, maybe aiming to create a passed pawn that's vital right from the opening.
Wow, okay. So those four things, piece development, central control, king safety, and pawn structure, they're like the checklist for a good opening.
That's a great way to think about it. Chess theory, the kind you find in those big books, essentially evaluates openings based on how well they achieve these goals and what kind of specific advantages or imbalances arise.
Okay, that framework makes the whole idea of opening theory seem less random. It's all built on these principles.
Exactly. Now, knowing the principles is one thing. How do we actually navigate the jungle of different named openings? There are hundreds.
Yeah, the Ruy Lopez, the Sicilian, the Queen's Gambit. Where do they all fit?
Well, the most common way to start organizing them is by White's very first move. That move kind of sets the basic character.
So like 1-point E4 openings versus 1-point D4 openings.
Precisely. 1-point E4 openings, often called king's pawn openings. White pushes the king's pawn 2 squares. This immediately opens lines for the queen and the king's bishop.
And these tend to be more attacking.
Often, yeah. They can lead to what are called open games, where pawn structures are broken up early, lines are open, and tactics tend to feature prominently. Or semi-open games, if black responds differently. Think sharp, dynamic possibilities.
Okay, and 1-point D4 openings, queen's pawn openings.
These start with the queen's pawn. They also fight for the center, but they often lead to more closed or semi-closed positions initially. The pawn structures might stay intact longer, leading to games focused more on maneuvering, positional play, building up pressure slowly.
So maybe a bit less immediate fireworks compared to 1-point E4.
Generally, yes, although they can become very tactical later on. And then you have the flank openings.
Like starting with 1-point C4, the English?
Exactly, or 1-point NF3. Here, White doesn't immediately push a central pawn. Instead, they try to control central squares like D5 or E4 from the side, often planning to push a central pawn later. These tend to be quite positional and flexible.
Okay, so 1-point E4, 1-point D4, and flank openings are the main families. Now, maybe we could look at the ideas behind a few specific examples, not the complex variations, but just what's the point of playing them?
Perfect. That's much more useful than reciting moves. Let's start with a giant of the 1-point E4, E5 world, the Ruy Lopez, or Spanish king. It goes 1-point E4, E5, 2-point NF3, NC6, 3-point BB5.
Right. White attacks black's e-pawn, black defends with the knight, then white develops the bishop to b5. What's the idea behind that bishop move?
Okay, 3-point B5 puts immediate pressure on the knight on C6. That knight is defending black's E5 pawn. So white is subtly hinting at maybe capturing the knight to damage black's pawn structure, or potentially winning the E5 pawn later if black isn't careful.
So it's indirect pressure.
Exactly. It's not an immediate threat, but it creates long-term tension. The Ruy Lopez is often about white building up slow, steady pressure, trying to gain a small but lasting advantage in space or structure, particularly targeting black's center and kingside.
And how does black usually respond to that pressure?
There are tons of ways. A very common one is 3-point A6, kicking the bishop.
Asking the question, what are you going to do with that bishop?
Right. White can retreat it, usually B4, maintaining the tension, or capture on C6, BXC6, which changes the pawn structure immediately. Black might also choose to develop another piece first, like 3-point NF6, the Berlin defense. Each choice leads to different types of positions, some very solid and positional, others incredibly sharp and tactical, like the Archangel variation where black might sacrifice the pawn structure for active pieces.
So the Ruy Lopez is about this long-term strategic fight stemming from that early BB5 pressure.
That's the core idea, yes. White's persistent pressure versus black's attempts to consolidate and find counterplay.
Okay. What about another 1-point E4, E5 opening, the Italian game? That's 1-point E4, E5, 2-point NF3, NC6, 3-point BC4.
Ah, the Italian, also very classical. Here, white puts the bishop on C4 instead of B5.
What's the difference in idea?
Well, BC4 immediately puts pressure on black's F7 square. That's often the weakest point around the black king early on. It also controls key central squares. The Italian generally leads to more open, straightforward positions compared to the Ruy Lopez.
More focused on just getting pieces out quickly.
Yeah, rapid development, fighting for the center in a very direct way. Both sides often castle kingside quickly. It's a great opening for learning fundamental tactics and positional ideas because the plans are often quite clear. Control the center, develop pieces to good squares, ensure king's safety. It can get sharp, of course, especially in lines like the Evans Gambit, but the basic setup is very classical.
So Italian.
Yeah.
Classical development, central focus, maybe a bit more direct than the Ruy Lopez.
Got it. Now, let's talk of the big one after 1.e4, the Sicilian defense. 1.e4c5 feels totally different.
Oh, it is. Night and day, almost. The Sicilian is Black's most popular and arguably most fighting response to 1.e4.
Why fighting? What makes it so different? Because with 1.c5, Black immediately creates an asymmetry in the pawn structure. Black isn't mirroring White's central pawn push with point e5 or d5. Instead, Black uses a wing pawn, the c-pawn, to fight for central control.
How does a wing pawn fight for the center?
The idea is that if White plays the natural d4 move soon, which happens in the open Sicilian, Black will almost always play .cxd4. After White recaptures, usually with the knight and xd4, White has a pawn on e4. Black doesn't have a pawn directly opposite it. White has a central pawn majority.
Okay, White has more pawns in the middle. That sounds good for White.
It is structurally often a long-term plus. White gets more space, but, and this is the crucial but of the Sicilian, Black gets compensation.
What kind of compensation?
Usually dynamic compensation. Black often gets an open c-file for their rook after the pawn trade. Black might get a queenside pawn majority, more pawns on the queen side, which can become dangerous later. Black's pieces often find active squares quickly, so Black accepts a slightly inferior pawn structure, maybe, in return for active piece play and counterattacking chances.
So it's unbalanced from the start, a trade-off. White gets central space, Black gets dynamic potential.
Exactly. That imbalance is the heart of the Sicilian. It leads to sharp, complex, double-edged games where both sides often have chances to attack. It avoids the symmetry you might see in 1.e4-e5 lines.
And White has different ways to approach this. You mentioned the open Sicilian.
Right. The open Sicilian with an early d4 leads to those typical asymmetrical structures and is where most of the really sharp theory lies.
Yeah.
But White can also choose the closed Sicilian, avoiding an early d4, maybe playing nc3 and g3, aiming for a slower, more positional buildup. Or White could try gambits like the Smith-Morra, sacrificing a pawn with d4 and c3 for quick development, or the Alapin variation, 2.c3, aiming for a strong pawn center without entering the main open lines.
And Black must have countless ways to play, too. I hear names like Dragon, Najdorf.
Oh, absolutely. Within the open Sicilian, Black has many setups. The dragon involves fianchettoing the dark squared bishop on g7, toward g6 and boot d7, aiming for kingside counterplay along the long diagonal. The Najdorf, often starting 5.e6, is incredibly flexible, keeping options open. The Scheveningen builds a small, solid pawn center with pawns on e6 and d6. The classical involves nc6. Each system has its own character, its own typical plans, some leading to insane attacks with opposite side castling, others more positional.
Wow, so the Sicilian is this huge universe of dynamic, unbalanced positions where Black fights back immediately.
That's the takeaway. It's complex, yes, but the core idea is creating imbalance and seeking active counterplay against White's central presence. Not just trying to equalize, but often playing for the win for move 1.
Okay, let's switch to 1.d4 openings, the Queen's Gambit, 1.b4, d5, 2.c4. You said this isn't really a gambit.
Right. In most lines, it's not a true sacrifice. If Black takes the pawn with 2.dxe4, the Queen's Gambit accepted, or QGA, White can usually regain it fairly easily if they want to, often with a move like e3 or e4 later, hitting the pawn or developing the bishop to capture it.
So why offer the pawn with c4 then? What's White's goal?
White's goal with 2.c4 is, again, central control. It immediately puts pressure on Black's d5 pawn. White is saying, I'm fighting for the center, maybe trying to swap my flank c-pawn for your central d-pawn to get a central majority, or just putting pressure on your central foothold.
So similar goal to 1.e4, central control, but a different method.
Exactly, and it often leads to more sustained central tension. Black doesn't have to take the pawn. The most common response is the Queen's Gambit declined, QGD, where Black supports the d5 pawn, usually with 2.e6 or 2.c6.
And what kind of games result from the QGD?
These often lead to strategically rich positions. Pawn structures become really important. For example, sometimes White gets an isolated queen's pawn, IQP, a pawn on d4, with no friendly pawns on the c or e files.
Is that good or bad?
It's double-edged. The IQP can be a weakness because it's hard to defend and can be blockaded, but The side with the IQP often gets more space, open lines for their pieces, and attacking chances.
Yeah.
So it leads to dynamic struggles.
Okay. Any other typical structures?
You might see hanging pawns, typically pawns on c4 and d4 for white, or c5, d5 for black, with no pawn supporting them from the b or e files. Again, double-edged. They control space, but can be targets. The QGD often involves maneuvering to either attack these structures or use the dynamic potential they offer. Black's main counter idea is often the tot c5 pawn break, trying to liquidate the center or open lines.
So Queen's Gambit often leads to these positional battles revolving around specific pawn formations.
Very much so. Understanding how to play with or against an IQP or hanging pawns is key to mastering these lines. It's less about immediate tactics, more about long-term strategy and structure.
Okay, and there's a sharp line within the QGD family, the semi-side.
Ah, yes, the semi-Slav defense. This usually arises after moves like 1.d4, d5, 2.c4, c6, 3.n3, and antim4 to nfc3, e6. Black combines the ideas of ton c6 Slav and point e6, QGD.
What's the main idea here? It looks solid.
It is solid, but it has a very sharp side. A key point is that the pawn on e6 initially blocks black's light-squared bishop on c8.
Right, the bishop is stuck behind the pawns.
Temporarily, yes. But black often plans to solve this later, maybe by playing point b5 and developing the bishop to b7, a fianchetto. And black often prepares the die c5 break, sometimes combined with point b5, leading to queenside expansion. Certain lines, like the Marin variation or the even sharper anti-Marin Botvinnik system, lead to incredibly complex tactical positions where both sides have to know a lot of theory. Black accepts the temporary awkward bishop for dynamic queenside play and central counterstrikes.
So the semi-Slav can be deceptively sharp, with black aiming for queenside action.
Extremely sharp in some lines. Critical and tactical. It shows how even within the generally closed 1.d4 world, you can get wild games.
Fascinating. Now, what about the other big family against 1.d4, the Indian defenses, starting 1.d4 and f6?
Right. Here, black plays 1 and f6 instead of 1.d5. This is a more flexible approach. Black develops a knight first, keeping options open regarding the central pawns, d-pawn and e-pawn.
So black isn't committing to a specific central structure right away?
Exactly. And a common theme in many Indian defenses is the fianchetto of one or both bishops.
Developing the bishop on the long diagonal, like g7 or b7?
Yes. Let's take the king's Indian defense, IDT, typically. 1.d4 nf6, 2.c4 g6, 3.nc3 bg7. Black fianchettos the kingside bishop. White often continues by building a big pawn center, maybe with e4 and d5.
So black just lets white take the center. That seems counterintuitive based on the principles.
It seems that way, but black has a plan. The kid is fundamentally a counterattacking defense. Black says, okay, white, you can have the center for now. I'm going to finish my kingside development, castle quickly, and then I'm going to launch an attack against your center or your king, often using pawn pushes like point f5 or maybe point e5 or point c5.
Ah, so concedes space temporarily to build up for a counterpunch.
Precisely. Black often aims for a kingside attack, pushing pawns, pawn f5, f4, to g5, g4, to open lines against the white king, especially if white castles kingside. White, in turn, often tries to use their space advantage to expand on the queen side or break through in the center.
Sounds like another sharp, unbalanced struggle.
Very much so. Games in the kid are often races black attacking on the king side, white on the queen side or center. It requires a good understanding of dynamics and timing. White has various ways to combat it too, like the Samish variation, playing f3 to solidify the center, or the bayonet attack, a rapid kingside pawn storm by white.
Okay. King's Indian. Concede center, fianchetto, counterattack, often on the king side. What about something like the row bash, or modern defense? 1.d6 against either 1.e4 or 1.d4.
Ah, the modern row batch, often grouped with the Pirk if black plays point d6 and nf6 later. This is even more flexible, or maybe hyper-modern is the word. Black plays 1.g6, preparing the kingside fianchetto before even committing the knight to f6.
So even less commitment than the King's Indian initially.
Right. Black lets white occupy the center, pretty much however white wants, planning to undermine or attack it later with pawn breaks like pawn c5 or point e5, supported by that powerful bishop on g7. It's very flexible because black can choose different pawn structures depending on how white sets up.
Where does black typically find counterplay?
It can vary. Sometimes it's central breaks, sometimes queenside play after white overextends in the center. Black aims to provoke white into creating weaknesses and then exploit them. White usually gets a comfortable space advantage early on, but black maintains a solid structure and hopes to outplay white strategically later. It's a fighting defense, offering chances for complexity without necessarily memorizing concrete lines, like in the kid main variations.
So Indian defenses generally involve this idea of flexibility, fianchettos, and counterattack rather than direct confrontation in the center early on.
That's a very good summary of the philosophy.
Okay, one last category, flank openings. The main one being the English opening, 1 point c4.
The English, a very solid, respected opening. White plays 1 point c4, controlling the d5 square from the flank.
Not grabbing the center directly, but influencing it.
Exactly. White often follows up with moves like nc3, g3, bg2. The kingside fianchetto is common, delaying the push of the d-pawn. The idea is often to maintain flexibility, see how black sets up, and then decide on the central structure. White might play d4 later, transposing into 1 point d4 lines, or might keep the tension.
What's the general feel of the English? Positional, tactical.
Historically, it's seen as more positional, subtle maneuvering. White aims for small advantages, control over key squares, especially d5. However, modern theory has shown it can lead to very sharp and dynamic positions too, depending on the variation. It's less forcing than 1 point e4, giving both players more options early on. Its popularity kind of ebbs and flows. Sometimes computers favor it, sometimes humans prefer the directness of 1 point e4.
So English, flexible, flank control of the center, often positional, but can get sharp.
That captures it well. It requires a good feel for different types of pawn structures because it can lead almost anywhere.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot of ground principles, categories, the core ideas of several major opening systems. This feels much more manageable than just seeing a list of names.
Good, because the next step for you, the listener, is figuring out how to use this. How do you actually build an opening repertoire that works for you?
Right. It's not about knowing all of these, is it?
Absolutely not. It's about finding openings that suit your style. This is maybe the most important piece of advice.
What do you mean by style?
Well, are you more comfortable in wide-open tactical battles where calculation is key? Do you enjoy launching attacks, maybe sacrificing material for initiative?
Like maybe a Sicilian player or someone who likes gambit.
Exactly. Or are you more comfortable in quieter positions? Do you like building up pressure slowly, maneuvering your pieces, focusing on good pawn structures, maybe grinding out an endgame advantage?
Perhaps someone who prefers the Queen's Gambit declined, or the English, or the Italian game.
Precisely. There's no right or wrong style, but openings definitely have different characters. Playing an opening that feels unnatural to you, that leads to positions you just don't understand or enjoy, that's going to be tough.
So step one is a bit of self-reflection. What kind of chess do I actually like playing?
Yes. And then use resources, maybe browse through games in different openings, look at the typical positions that arise to find systems that seem to match that preference. Those big opening books are great for this kind of exploration.
Not for memorizing page 1 to page 500, but for sampling the flavors.
Exactly. Find a couple of options you like as white, maybe one main line against 1 point e5 and one against 1 point c5, for example. Find something reliable as black against 1 point e4 and 1 d4. That's your starting point.
And then what, once you've picked a few?
Then you dive deeper into those openings. But again, focus on the ideas. What are the main plans for both sides? What are the typical pawn structures? Where do the pieces usually go? What are the common tactical tricks or motifs? What kind of middle game are you aiming for?
Understanding the why behind the moves in your chosen openings.
That's the key. Knowing the typical plans is far more valuable than memorizing 20 moves deep in one specific variation, because your opponents won't always play the book moves. If you understand the ideas, you can figure out what to do even when things go off track.
And this connects directly to the middle game, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The opening seamlessly transitions into the middle game. The pawn structure you get from the opening dictates the available plans. Is the center open or closed? Do you have a space advantage? Does your opponent have weak pawns, or are there open files for your rooks? All these features, shaped by the opening, tell you what you should be trying to achieve in the middle game.
So studying opening ideas is really studying middle game blueprints.
In a very real sense, yes. You learn to recognize the types of positions that arise from your openings, and you learn the standard ways to handle them.
This has been hugely clarifying. Let's try to boil it down. For that high school player listening, wanting to get better at openings, what are the absolute must-remember takeaways?
Okay, takeaway number 1. Master those fundamental principles. Always think about rapid, harmonious development, central control, king safety, and good pawn structure. They are your guideposts.
Got it. Principles first.
Second, don't just learn names, learn the strategic character of different openings. Think. Ruy Lopez pressure, Sicilian imbalance, Queen's Gambit structure, Indian counterattack. Get a feel for the ideas.
Understand the personality of the openings. Okay.
Third, choose openings that fit your style. Find positions you genuinely enjoy playing and understanding. Don't force yourself into something that feels wrong. Experiment, then commit to learning a few systems well.
Play what feels right for you. Makes sense.
And finally, remember that opening study isn't just about the first 10 moves. It's about understanding the resulting middle games. Learn the typical plans, pawn structures, and tactical themes associated with your chosen openings. Focus on the why, not just the what.
Build that bridge from the opening to the middle game plan.
Exactly. It's about creating a strategic roadmap for the whole game, starting from move 1.
Fantastic. This deep dive, drawing on the kind of knowledge found in those comprehensive guides, really helps demystify opening strategy. It's not about memorizing an encyclopedia, but about understanding core concepts.
Hopefully it makes tackling openings feel much more approachable and, frankly, more interesting.
Definitely. Explore the ideas, find your fit, and focus on understanding.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. When you study opening concepts, you're not just learning sequences of moves. You're learning the fundamental language of chess strategy, how pieces and pawns work together, the value of space, the importance of structure, the dynamics of attack and defense. That understanding goes way beyond any specific opening. It deepens your feel for the entire game.
Learning the building blocks of chess itself, a great way to think about it. Thanks so much for walking us through that.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating part of chess.
And thank you for joining us on the deep dive.